Hello and welcome to Book Club, where this month our readers are clutching their copies of The Hippopotamus, which means that the author in our midst is Stephen Fry, whose second novel this was. He is, of course, actor, comic, director, writer. There have been 5 novels now, and in this one he indulges himself, really, in a whirl of satire and sometimes bad taste that catches some of the shallowness of the glitzy world that encompasses the Harpo Club. Guess what that might represent? A snobbish and deeply unattractive family in an English country house, and many sexual games and deceits. The principal character is Ted Wallace, who's a tipsy, sacked drama critic, and not a very appealing character at all, who's sent out on a bizarre mission by his goddaughter, who says she's dying of leukemia, to find out about some strange goings-on at Swafford Hall. The plot is sometimes a farce, and it's pretty filthy, I should say. It boils down to the rumbling of David, son of the house, an adolescent who persuades himself that he has special healing powers. He can even cure the leukemia, he thinks, although the whole thing turns out to be a form of teenage sexual release. In the end, Ted rumbles him. There's nothing mystical going on at Swafford Hall at all. Now, the book is a romp. It's full of dirty jokes and set-piece encounters and pheasant shoots and dinner tables, though with a rather dark undercurrent, which we'll come to later. And, Stephen, in welcoming you to Book Club, I've got to ask, first of all, when you created the character of Ted, although he's much older than you, did you put anything of yourself or your own feelings about yourself into him?
I think what I put in was what I imagined I might become, hoped that I wouldn't become, but a lot of it I respected. It was a compendium, the character, of John Osborne, Kingsley Amis, Simon Gray, people I had met and known who were brilliant, cantankerous, rebarbative, deeply sceptical, loathing of the modern world in varying degrees.
And you obviously have a kind of ambiguity towards that compendium character. At one level, you've got a certain attraction to this kind of louche behaviour. On the other hand, you think it's pretty repulsive. It
is repulsive. I mean, he is the hippopotamus of the title, but the hippopotamus of the title comes from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hippopotamus, which is about, of course, the Church of England, ultimately, but is, at the level of its metaphor, it is about the fact that people who are sunk in the mud have a far more real understanding of human nature and of the universe than people who are on mountaintops.
And that under the thick skin there is flesh and blood.
Absolutely right, exactly. And that's the very phrase that Eliot uses in his poem.
Did you like Ted at the end when you'd finished with him?
I respected him. I wouldn't want to spend any time with him. But what's important about him was that he's a poet, and a lot of what the book is about is what it is to be a poet.
Now let's bring in our readers.
My question is on the inspiration and the plot of The Hippopotamus. I've always loved your sparkling wit and very intelligent prose. So I was really looking forward to reading The Hippopotamus.
There's a but coming
here.
There's
a huge but.
The but is serious. What on earth inspired you to write such an implausible load of codswallop?
But it isn't implausible. Nothing happens.
Was it just the poem, The Hippopotamus? What was the inspiration behind it?
Well, the inspiration was that people would believe something absolutely preposterous has happened, but nothing happens in the book. An old man goes to see an old army friend of his in his house, where people have rather hysterically thought that they've got better and that this boy has got magic powers. That's all. I mean, that's hardly codswallop. That's all that happens.
What's the inspiration apart from the poem? Was there something that made you write the book?
Yes, anger at people's gullibility, which, I wrote this 10 years ago. Anger at still seeing horoscope columns, still seeing people talking, still misquoting Hamlet. Oh, there are more things in heaven than earth and are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. And you just want to punch them so hard in the face that you'd have to go to prison for it because it makes you so cross. And the anti-science, oddly enough, as much as anti-poetry, because I think poetry and science have a huge amount in common. They build on what is known and seen and understandable. And, of course, yes, what you might call milieu is not. I wasn't going to set this amongst Colombian coffee farmers because I didn't have the time to go and research it. It's not something I felt and know about. I do know about the English country house novel, such as it is, as a thing to subvert. Also, I was very interested in the nature and identity of the Anglo Jewry, these people who came over from Hungary to settle in England and had this this mixture, what is Jewish and what is English, which on the one hand Jews brought to England, my grandfather being Jewish, this is always part of, so it's a part of a family history in a strange kind of way as well. The character Logan is sort of not exactly based on my grandfather, but the idea that there is this mixture of the Dibuk, the kind of mysterious Jew from Europe, who comes with his mystery, plus the Jews who open up the world. The entire 19th century was opened up by Jews, or for some destroyed by the Jew Freud, who said we no longer had control over who we were. We were in fact controlled by something inside us that we couldn't control, our subconscious and its three elements. By Marx, who said that history determined us, we didn't determine history, and by Einstein, who showed the extraordinary contingency of the entire universe. And so this nature of what Jews did to the solid world of the English country house, which they inhabit, it does have a symbolic level, this novel, if you like, which is to do with that, to do with the nature of England, to do with what we are composed of. And its form is farcical to some extent, yes. As to what inspired me, I don't know.
It's a good moment to dive into the book itself now, I think, and have a section which you'll read for us. Set the scenes, Stephen.
Well, our hero, Ted Wallace, has met this goddaughter of his, whom he hasn't seen since the font, when she's now this rather hysterical, very rich woman, because she's the nephew of a kind of Maxwell figure, the kind of tycoon from Eastern Europe who has become more English than the English. And she's invited him back to his house, and it seems to be rather important that he goes back. So he goes back and is disgusted by rich person's interior decoration that he sees and is tactful about it. And this is how the conversation proceeds. "They tell me I have an eye," she said. "Homes and Interiors were here last week photographing." "I'm sure they were," I said. "You should have seen the place when I moved in. Such a sense of light and space," I sighed, always utterly safe. "Men don't usually appreciate such things," she said with approval, moving to the drinks table. "Bog off, you mad, sad bitch," I said inside, while even a man couldn't fail to be knocked out by this skilful, tasteful blend of the ethnic and the domestic, said my cowardly, outspread arms. It was Macallan, I noticed, she was saying. "There's a Lefroig, if you'd rather." No, the Macallan does." She brought them over, folded a leg under herself, and sank down on an ottoman, which was moronically tricked out in a design which would turn out, I supposed, to be taken from some Mayan funeral shroud or mystic Balinese menstrual cloth. The grand idea behind such a squalid episode of cultural rape and the other equally feeble, equally impertinent conceits that littered this appalling room, I supposed, was that Jane would dispose herself there, surrounded by friends, the diversity of whose drinking habits would justify the ludicrous range of unopened liqueur, aperitif and spirit bottles on display, while gentle yet probing conversational topics were flicked like shuttlecocks about the room. Instead, she sat, still trembling like an adolescent, with nothing more for company than a raddled has-been who once knew her parents, and he, despite the gallons of free whiskey on offer, was wishing himself violently elsewhere. She swirled the drink in its tumbler. "The first thing you have to know," she said at last, "is that I am dying."
You love war. Was there a deliberate homage to vile bodies there?
Yes, 10 years later, oddly, I directed a film based on vile bodies and wrote a screenplay about it. I'd always loved Evelyn Waugh, and there is a great debt to him there. I think almost anyone who writes in English is indebted to him.
Yes, you have a question.
Yes, Stephen, talking about use of language, I was actually thinking of another author who you're very close to, P.G. Wodehouse, and the use of English, the wonderful use of English. You revel in the use of all registers of language, of good English, and yet in the book you refer to the plastic and styrofoam garbage that litters the 20th century linguistic floor. Now, would you like to expand a little bit about that? Is that your view as much as the narrator's there, about the quality of language that's used nowadays?
I'm so glad you mentioned that particular passage, the plastic and styrofoam garbage that litters our linguistic floor, because it's in that section that he's really talking about what defines him as a poet. I think we live in an age in which people find it much easier to learn about music and about all kinds of other arts, sculpture and so on. And all those arts have reserved materials. If you want to be a sculptor, you can get bronze, you can get marble, and you get a chisel. If you're a painter, you get linseed and turpentine and paints and acrylics, all kinds of things. If you're a poet, All you have is, as Ted says, access to is this plastic and styrofoam rubbish that litters our linguistic floor, i.e. language. The same thing I'm using to talk to you now, the same thing I use when I want to order a pizza, the same thing I use when I want to ask the way to the nearest lavatory. It's a debased coinage language, as far as a poet is concerned. In the 18th century, in the 19th century, there was a refined poetical language you could use. Ted doesn't have that. He has to use the ordinary. And for me, and for the novel, the ordinary juxtaposed with the grandiose is precisely what makes English so rich.
Yes, what do you want to ask?
Faith always comes up in your books.
Yes.
It's generally traditional or conventional religious faiths. Occasionally it's to do with dolphins and crystals and what have you, and ley lines. Is faith important to you? Do you think it's important to humanity as a whole?
Yes, I do. I think it's very important. I mean, I think faith in each other is much harder than faith in God or faith in crystals. I very rarely have faith in God, occasionally have little spasms of it, but they go away, I think, hard enough about it. And I never have faith in, I mean, I'm incandescent with rage at the idea of horoscopes and of crystals and of the nonsense of New Age, or indeed even more pseudoscientific things, self-help and the whole culture of searching for answers, when for me, as someone brought up in a tradition of Western, unashamed Western tradition of music and poetry and philosophy, all those answers are there in the work that has been done by humanity before us, in literature, in art, in science, in all the marvels that have created this moment now, instead of people looking away. The image to me, which Ted mentions in the book, is gold does exist, and for gold, say truth, say the answer, say love, say justice, say anything. It does exist, but the only way in this world you can achieve gold is to be incredibly intelligent about geology, to learn what mankind has learned, to learn where it might lie, and then break your fingers and blister your skin in digging for it, and then sweat and sweat in a forge and smelt it, and you will have gold. But you will never have it by closing your eyes and wishing for it. No angel will lean out of the bar of heaven and drop down sheets of gold for you. And we live in a society in which people believe they will. But the real answer, that there is gold, and that all you have to do is try and understand the world enough to get down into the muck of it, and you will have it. You will have truth, you will have justice, you'll have understanding, but not by wishing for it.
Ted is a poet, but yet you have him compose many very rude limericks. Is that a hobby of yours? I translated the Hippopotamus into Hebrew, and that was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do, translate your limericks.
For publication, we should say. I mean, a proper translation for publication.
Yes, yes. And
did you have to clean it up as a matter of interest?
No. Actually, I added a bit of myself, knowing that Stephen would never know.
You've never been to Israel, Jim. It's the filthiest place to live. Imagine a very, very dark sense of humour. But yes, I mean, he writes limericks. He apologises at one point, I seem to remember, for the fact that he said, you know, the muse has dried up. I'm kind of artistically constipated, so I do now, in a kind of almost an act of self-disgust, I do stupid limericks.
Give us one.
One of his. Well,
Yes.
there's a moment when it's a rather complicated moment, but the boy Davy has had an accident to his membrum virile, or perhaps it's a membrum puerile in his case, and Ted has to take him to a hospital, and it's a very important point here. The doctor assumes that Ted has been doing something dreadful to a 15-year-old boy, because she's seen there are human bite marks on this membrum virile, and Ted is far too innocent to have even thought that it was his fault. You know, he says, you know, I'm filthy, I'm down in the dust, therefore I never think the worst. It's only people who are up on mountaintops who think the worst. But anyway, this doctor is called Dr. Fraser, and she has these gimlet blue eyes, and she's given him a very hard time until she believes the truth. And he says, I composed a little present for her in the notepad. There's a beautiful doctor called Fraser, with a glance like a surgical laser. If you're guilty of sin, she'll stare at your chin and save you the price of a razor. I mean, it's doggerel, of course, but it's a form, and he believes in the form of poetry. He has rants, I don't know if you noticed, about, against open field poetry, i.e. the kind of Ginsberg, O'Hara American poetry of the 50s.
Mentioning the sort of dirtier, filthier aspects of the book, I was wondering, is there a point at which you would stop your imagination reaching a page, where you think you would stop writing and not let something be published or be written? Do you think there's a point where that needs to happen?
I do have, I have to say, I have a much cleaner mind than the kind of people who are offended by Bandaged. I was shocked when people were offended by the book, because it never shocks me that what humans are. You know, I know what we are, We all know what we are, and it always surprises me when people say, yes, but there's no need to say it. Well, writing novels is precisely because there is a need to say what we are. And we say what we are about our violence, our capacity for evil. I mean, the percentage of the book which is predicated on or involves sexual congress of any kind is absolutely minuscule. But we are all still rather victims of being shocked by it. And, of course, people hate being told they're shocked. But I'm not shocked, I just think it's unnecessary. And I would say to them, well, do you remember that scene when there's a cup of tea and I described it being poured? That wasn't necessary, was it? I could have just cut straight from would you like a cup of tea to him finishing the cup. I didn't have to show him actually drinking it. No, but that's not the same. Well, yes, it is. It's an unshockable thing being described in an unnecessary way. Tea.
You're listening to Book Club on BBC Radio 4 with Stephen Fry discussing his novel, The Hippopotamus.
Probably the part of the book that affected me the most was... And I was very surprised by it, because it's all very funny and very interesting, and it's really... The ideas are wonderful, and suddenly you do go back a very long way in time into this very moving family history of these refugees from Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and the making of this man, and this very rich man, and it was very disjointed. Everything has, up to then has been sort of very Ted Wallace cynical, and it's suddenly very tender and moving, and I was wondering if you had a comment on that part of the process.
Yes, it is tender, and it's kind of at the heart of it. It's sort of... it always sounds very pompous if you use these phrases, but the sort of entropy that, you know, there is a dynasty that's founded, there's a kind of purity, and it's an awful purity in terms of what takes you out of Europe. You start with nothing, you arrive in England with nothing, you're just there, and all the energy to work and to make yourself and to prove yourself and to become something, and then onto the next generation it just starts falling into this mess, you know.
For you, is that the heart of the book?
I think it probably is. I think that's where... the emotional heart for me is, I think its intellectual heart is obviously in Ted's insistence that because he is a poet, he knows a lie when he sees one. You know, the fact that...
And he does,
yes,
according to the book.
Absolutely, and he does. But he means it. Because you're a poet, you can see, because poetry only works when it's true.
There are some arresting descriptive images for mental activity in the book, such as mental itches popping like bubbles, and my favourite, compiling a list for me is like laying out a formal garden in the rubbishy wilderness of my mind. Is the process of writing a novel, for you, like sorting out all the rubbishy wilderness in your mind?
That's beautifully put. I like it. Yes, I think there's some truth in that. I've always been very interested in trying to understand my own mind, but especially when you write a book, you do, because you don't know where all the things come from. You know they come out of you and of you, but you don't quite consciously know how they come. I always liked the various images for the human mind. I loved Sherlock Holmes's idea, you know, that the human mind was like an attic room which didn't have rubber walls, so you had to store in it. It didn't expand. You had to throw out the things you didn't need to know, and which is a wonderfully Victorian idea of it as being like a sort of one of those huge kind of bits of furniture with tiny little cubby holes in, you know, that they love for collecting seeds or bits of pharmacopoeia or whatever it would be.
In that process of discovery and organisation, if that's what it is, how conscious were you? You've already referred to the autobiographical strain in the refugee sections of the book. How conscious were you of your own spectacularly troubled adolescence, which in the end got you into jail?
Well, very, very aware, and this is a bit which would embarrass my brother, much as Simon is embarrassed in the book, the decent brother. And another part of the book was really me sort of setting out my sense, without undue modesty or ridiculous self-flagellation, that as a very gifted child, which I was in certain ways, but a very backward one in others, emotionally and in terms of my, maturity as a human being, was a ghastly mess. But I was very flip and agile-witted and able to pass exams without rehearsing and so on, and I was forward in my reading and apparent sophistication and understanding of literature and things. And my brother was a far more, if one might say it, again it sounds insulting in this direction, normal person. And in my 30s, when I was writing Hippopotamus, I would look at my brother and his two children and his life and think what an extraordinarily noble person he was. And it would make me almost want to cry. I just saw that this was the foundation of everything that made any society, Britain, because he happens to be British and live in Britain, and because, that's where we are, but almost anywhere. He's the kind of man who would travel 17 miles to rescue someone who's stuck in the snow and never complain about it. He'd be shaking with embarrassment to be talking about him like this. And all the fuss that I caused as an adolescent, they're going to prison, they're being expelled from schools, while he hung around as this decent, kind fellow, never minding that all the attention went on Stephen and Stephen's latest problems. Or then, when I eventually got out of the problems, got out of prison and got a scholarship to Cambridge, it was then, oh, good old Stephen, look, he's in the footlights, he's going to be on television, and he's making all this money, and you know, he was always delighted for me. And I sort of realised that David is like that. He's apparently skillful, this beautiful child, in his case, which I never was, as you can well imagine. With all this sort of sensitivity that he has, while this brother kind of clods along in the background, sort of talking about horses, and oh yes, well, the swines have got flu again, or whatever. And you realise that's the noble one. He is the and so a lot of it was a kind of testament to my brother, or not, if not specifically to him, because it would embarrass him, to people like him. Not the ones with the language and the gift of the gab, not the ones who can paint, not the ones who appear on the red carpet at the award ceremonies. They are the people who just live and make the world work.
Stephen, getting a little bit personal now, if I may. Emma Thompson famously once described you as 90% gay, 10% other. And you have in your writing, particularly in More Was My Washpot, you've been very frank about your early sexual experiences, including, indeed, the heterosexual. Can you tell us a little bit about Ted's virtuoso rant about the sexuality of women and
yes.
how you approach that, if I may use that expression?
Well, I've had many letters of thanking me with, as it were, tears in their eyes from readers and indeed conversations with friends, straight heterosexual male friends thanking me for this, and very few women thanking me for it, although I believe, as Ted says, that this is the most congratulatory letter to women. He talks about, Ted is very driven by his loins, and he knows how much greater his desire to have quick releasing sex is than any woman he meets, except one or two very rare ones. And we see that in the world. It's obviously true. But why women should regard it as an insult, why they would want to be such base animals as men are, God only knows.
If you want to write a letter, you know the address.
Again, it's sex again, actually, as a matter of fact. Every sexual element in this book generally turns out disastrously. However, I mean, like, does this reflect some sort of your personal... I mean, you had a very, very long stance of celibacy. Somehow view sex differently now than before, or...?
I suppose if I'm brutally honest, as you have been, and forced me to be with myself, there is no question that I still find... I mean, of course it's a marvellous thing in some ways, transformative and all that kind of thing, yippee, and everything. I've always found it embarrassing in fiction when it's serious. I mean, when Lawrence is trying to, make it ecstatic and plumes, serpents, rose, and all that. I just think it's a complete hoot and nonsense. It is a very humiliating thing that nature has done to us, that God, if one wants to... But, it's easy to give it this name, that, fine, all right, we have to reproduce, and for various evolutionary reasons, we don't just, it's not parthenogenic, we don't just bud off our own bodies, we mix different DNAs, and that all makes sense, I can follow all that. But why make the very organs and instruments of the sexual game absolutely adjacent to the very same bits that expel our most fetid poisons? I mean, it's an incredibly cruel idea. It's like some Nazi guard saying, "Here's your lunch, Colonel Donaldson. I've wrapped it in paper and thrown it into a cess tank." It seems very mean, don't you think?
I'm not going to answer that question. We've got another question here.
Well, you obviously love telling a story, and I think you could talk the hind legs of a donkey. But
let's not bring donkeys
into the back lady. Oh, yes, donkeys.
Now, the prose of Hippopotamus, or a horse, the prose of Hippopotamus sounds rather like you telling a very long after-dinner anecdote, having consumed a few glasses of claret.
Good, yes.
How long did it take you to write the Hippopotamus?
Oh, a long time. I mean, for me, a long time. 7 months, I would say. And that's exactly the tone was wanted, because as Jim said in his introduction, it's kind of a whiskey-sodden, if not wine-sodden, version of myself in terms... The gusto of the language I couldn't pretend to be able to come up with ad hoc in like that. The tone of voice is very different from my other books. Very, it is, I think, a realised character, but that he's of me, yes.
Did you dictate it, or did you write it?
Oh, God, I can dictate it. Heavens knows, that's what you meant. No, I look at footage of, someone like Barbara Cartland lying on a sofa, and dictating a novel. I cannot imagine. I would die of embarrassment, apart from anything else. To whom would I dictate it? Or even if I dictated it into a machine and then sent it off to someone to type. No, I live. I'm part of an early generation of computer users. I use them, but I belong to a generation who types far more quickly than he writes, and indeed I type almost more quickly than I speak, which is hard to believe.
A last question.
this is a deeply serious novel in very many respects. It has a very serious message, I think, and I love it for that. But I also love it for its filthiness, for its disgusting language, and for its random humour. And you mentioned, we've talked about Wall, we've talked about Woodhouse. Which would you rather be at the end of the day? Would you rather be an entertainer, or would you rather be a serious novelist? Or does it come back to Ted and his limericks? Is it the same thing at the end of the day? The only serious way you can be is to write a limerick.
Again, a good question. I'm not sure. I can never really know for sure what the answer is about what I want, but I have an image sometimes of, I think in Icelandic and Norse literature, after a battle, there would be two hillsides after the battle. The Victorian side would feast, and there would be one hillside where the saga maker, the serious and remarkable poet, who would do this epic recitation of the battle, and Hengist's strength was of the strength of 40, and he did lift the whole tree trunk and did smite, Hagar the horrible, and it was and on the other hill would be a fellow called a glee man, and the glee man would say, and Hengist accidentally fell backwards over 3 members of the enemy, and because he's so fat he happened accidentally to kill them, and one of them was carrying the flag, so it demoralised the enemy, so by some fluke we won. But I can't be both, and I am a glee man, and I can't pretend I'm not.
So it is the glee man who's right.
I think it's the glee man who's right just about every time. Because that's what it is to be human. It's when you fall over and your face is in the mud. That's how things are decided.
And there, I'm afraid, we must leave it. Stephen Fry, thank you very much indeed for being our very welcome guest on Book Club this month.